I do a talk like this, which isn't often, but whenever I do it, I like to go back to the real basics, partly because I don't know much clever sort of theology stuff, and partly just because they're so important. Like, if we don't understand the basics behind our faith, we haven't got a hope of understanding anything more complicated. So this is going to be relatively simple, but it is very important, or at least I think it's important. And as I'm sure all of you know, the Bible starts in Genesis. So that's what we're looking at, is Genesis, particularly just verse 1, and actually just one word in that as well. We're getting really specific here. I started reading through Genesis in December, and I was going to do like a Bible in a year, sort of just read a chapter a day, it'll be easy. And I spent 2 hours reading Genesis, and I got through 2 verses because there is so much packed in them. I was just Googling things and looking words up and reading about it, and it was really interesting, but it took me 2 hours to get 2 verses into the Bible. That's not what I'm doing today. I don't want to spend 2 hours looking at 2 verses, but just one word in Genesis 1. I'm sure you've all heard the verse before. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what does created actually mean? Like, it's fairly important that we understand what the Bible actually tells us about creation. So in Hebrew, let's go back to the original words. That word is bara. I don't know how you say it. I think that's right. And it means that God created the earth from nothing. He didn't just arrange atoms to form the earth. He made the atoms and the subatomic particles that they're made of. He brought them into being. I'm not going to go into details about how he did that. There's loads of ways you can interpret exactly what that means. But the really important thing to get out of this verse is that God brought everything into existence. He didn't just form a world from atoms that already existed. He did make them. That's what the Bible tells us. So nothing could exist without him, which I find quite cool. And it is quite important to just our understanding of the world as a whole. And perhaps most importantly, this isn't just in Genesis 1. If it was just in one place in the Bible, I'd be slightly confused. The Bible repeats everything. It is very clear. So here's a nice list of verses. All of these are about creation. John 1:3 says, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. It's worded slightly strange. It does take a little bit of thinking to get your head around it. But all of these verses very clearly tell us that God created the world. It's like, if you ask any Christian, I'm pretty sure that they'll tell you that. I don't think this is something new. God made the world. Colossians 1:16-17 I particularly like. It says, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, this is just a small selection of verses, but with all the scripture to back me up, particularly that verse in Colossians that says, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, everything was created through God. I can confidently say that God didn't just make matter. We're not just talking about atoms here. But if he created all of that, he must have created the laws that govern it too. So this takes a little bit of thinking, and this is where the maths comes into play. But I just want to say straight away, we're just doing 1 + 1 is 2. That is the only maths I'm going to talk about. One sum, 1 + 1 makes 2. So I'm hoping you can all handle that. Like, I don't have the capacity for complicated maths any evening, so we're just keeping it simple. I was going to try and include some really horrible, long, complicated philosophical thing, but I realized that I can't really explain it, and maths is more fun anyway. So we're going to take a scientific approach. How do we prove that 1 + 1 is 2? Like, most scientists and philosophers try to reduce everything into axioms. These are like facts from which we can derive every other truth. But when you start thinking about these things, like 1 + 1 is 2, sure, we all accept it. But why? Like these axioms that we come up with, these fundamental truths, that are things that are just true. They're based on our experience, they make sense, but we can't actually prove them. Like even Newton's second law, or we've just done a module on thermodynamics in uni. This is the perfect example because my lecturer himself said, we can't prove anything that they've just taught us. They've given us all these laws, all of these rules, but we don't know that it's true. We just know that we've never proven them wrong. Like that's pretty much the basis of modern maths and science. And everything that we know about is, it makes sense, it's been correct in the past, and we've never proven it wrong. So we just sort of assume that things are true, that we can't prove. There are things that we can prove beyond reasonable doubt. Like, I know that I'm looking at a computer, I know that the world exists, basic things like that. But like mathematical truths, like 1 + 1 is 2, we just have no evidence for it. We can only go so far. We can only go so far as to say 1 + 1 is 2 because it is. So like, take like a child. By the age of 5, most people, I think, would understand 1 + 1 is 2 in some basic sense. 1 apple + 1 apple is 2 apples. Or much more exciting, say 1 cookie + 1 cookie makes 2 cookies. But if you ask anyone why that's the case, I would fairly confidently say the answer is just because it is, or I don't know. Maybe someone really clever will just say, they'll start talking about Arabic numerals and how we've made a number system, and a foundation of that is 1 + 1 makes 2. But in a physical sense, our only proof that every time we take one object and another object, we will have 2 objects is just based on our experience. I know that if I took 1 apple and another apple yesterday, I had 2 apples. So we know that 1 + 1 was 2 in the past. It's always been 2 in our experience, and it makes sense that 1 + 1 is 2. And it's strange to sort of think that there's no proof to it. Like when I was thinking through this in my head, and I was like, no, like it makes sense. 1 + 1 is 2. It just is. But I don't like the idea, and I hope you guys can sort of see this. Like the 1 + 1 just makes 2 doesn't seem like the best proof to me. Like no one can say for certain that if we took 1 apple and another apple to Mars, they wouldn't magically become 3 Martian apples. In our heads, that is obviously impossible. Like it doesn't make sense. We know that 1 + 1 is 2, but we just can't prove it with logic. It is just true. It's something that just defines the world. What I can prove is that 1 + 1 = 2 can't be proven. This sounds a bit strange, and I won't go into the details because this is where we get into like mathematical proof and statistics, and things get really strange and complicated. But the basics are this. Here's a book, Principia Mathematica. It is 100 years old, and 2 mathematicians, neither of whom were Christians, wanted to prove that maths just works. By starting with a few axioms, they wanted to prove that 1 + 1 was 2, that we could define all the laws of mathematics with a finite number of fundamental truths. They wanted to say, if we start with this list of things, we can calculate anything. We can prove why algebra works and why it makes sense. And it's 378 pages long, and they proved 1 + 1 makes 2 if we can define addition, which they could not. It took them 17 years of research. They got to the point where they could say 1 + 1 is 2 if we knew what plus meant, but they couldn't prove what plus meant. Like we know what it means, but from a mathematical, logical proof point of view, if you like, they couldn't prove it. And I get this is quite sort of strange. This is maybe a bit philosophical, but ultimately, if you ask any mathematician, aside from the fact that 1 + 1 is just 2, there's no other proof for it than that. And 3 years after this book was published, some guy called Kurt Gödel came along, and he basically told them it was all a waste of time. He proved something called Incompleteness Theory, which says that no set of axioms, no list of facts, or at least no finite list, no list that ends, can describe basic mathematics. You can describe a lot of things. You can say 1 + 1 is 2 is an axiom, and we can accept that. But it's impossible to prove all of maths. We can only prove that we can't prove all of maths. And as I said, this is where we get into complicated mathematical things, very confusing stuff. I don't want to go into the details, but the basics are, if you ask any mathematician why they believe that maths works, why can we trust that 1 + 1 is 2? Why can we trust the numbers? Aside from the fact that we just say that it's worked in the past, there's no reason to trust it if we start with a viewpoint that the world is random and we just want to define it based on a few laws that just happen to exist. And like this incompleteness theory, this idea that we can't prove what maths is generally accepted by all mathematicians, regardless of their beliefs. They will quite happily tell us we can't prove that 1 + 1 is 2 or why maths works, and we'll never be able to prove why maths works. It's a bit strange. So how can any mathematician trust their work? How can we say that, well, obviously 1 + 1 is 2, and from that we can start defining other laws and other relationships, 2 + 2 is 4. But why can we trust those numbers? That's what I'm trying to get at. And as I'm sure you can guess from the title I had up at the start, what I'm trying to get to, the most important part of this, ignoring all the mathematical sort of proof and the gibberish and all the strange symbols they have to prove that, we need to start with God. I should mention first though, because I'm sure like mathematicians aren't stupid. We know that you would expect them to have some reason. I don't just want to skip over that and say they're all wrong. They're not idiots. They have present arguments as to why maths should work, but they all end at a point of either saying it just works. We just have to define a certain number of laws and accept that we'll never fully be able to define maths. We just say 1 + 1 is 2, and that is a law. We just accept that that's how it's been in the past. That's what makes sense. And so 1 + 1 must always be 2. And you can leave it at that. And that's I think what most people would say is that 1 + 1 is just 2. But I'm not satisfied by that. Like, it's not enough, if you get what I mean. Like, we can say that 1 + 1 is just 2, sure. Or the other way mathematicians get around this is by redefining what a proof is. We say, well, okay, we don't want to prove it with logic. We don't want to, we know that we can't come up with just a list of laws, but we just say that proof is what we know is true. We say that, well, maths is defined by humans. We've come up with a number system. And so we can prove that 1 + 1 is 2, again, because we say so. There's basically the sort of the fundamental point here is, if you start from axioms and laws to define maths or science or anything else, you just get to decide what is true. We just say 1 + 1 is 2. That is a fact. We don't want to prove it. That's just where we start from. But the only explanation I've ever seen to prove why 1 + 1 is 2 always and every day is one that starts with God. See, I can be confident that 1 + 1 will still be 2 tomorrow. Whereas if we just say that we've decided that 1 + 1 is 2, there's no reason that I can't, you can't understand this. Well, I mean, you can understand this. What am I trying to say here? It's difficult to understand this, but we can't prove that if I went downstairs tomorrow and I picked up one apple and another apple, I wouldn't be holding 3 apples. We can say that 1 + 1 is 2, and we can just say that that's a fact, but we can't prove that it will always be true and it will never fail. The only way we can do that is if we start with God. And I've realized I've already started the waffling and the getting into maths, but where we need to go back to now is Genesis. God created the world. That world reflects him. It's not made in his image, and I should touch on this. Humans are made in God's image. That's what we're told in Genesis 1:27. We reflect God's character. we're made in his image, we're made like him. But the world is made by God, which means we can see his character in the world. It's not perfectly in his image, it doesn't reflect him, but it's still made by him. Like, you can tell when Picasso has painted a painting, it's different to, say, Leonardo da Vinci and Mona Lisa. They're clearly different artists. And in the same way, you can see God's artistry in the world. And one big element of that is consistency. God is consistent, and he's made a completely consistent world. So in the same way that God never changes, the natural laws that he created never change either. So I'm completely confident that 1 + 1 = 2 today, and it will stay true tomorrow and every day after that. But if we remove God from the picture and we say that the world is just random particles and energy, and they just interact and they're doing things, there's no reason, we know it in our heads, but there's no reason that 1 + 1 should make 2 tomorrow or the day after that. Now I understand that this, what I've just explained, is firstly a terrible explanation of this idea that 1 + 1 = 2. It's very perplexing. It took me a long time to sort of understand it myself, and like I was just sort of reading about it and reading things, not really understanding it, and then it just clicked, and I was like, okay, no, this does make sense. But I'll recap. Oh no, okay, I forgot my burning up the book animation for the incompleteness theory thing, but that's fine. We'll ignore that. The basics of this: we start in Genesis 1 with a consistent God. And I'll explain. I'll go into detail in a minute about why he's so consistent. And the consistent God made the world. That's what it tells us. He created the world, which means he also created the laws of nature, the laws that define it. And so if he created the world and he created the laws of nature, then they are consistent as well, because he made them. And one of the laws of nature, one thing that God created, that God defined, is 1 + 1 = 2. So that's how I can accept that 1 + 1 = 2. And that's why it's so important that we understand that this is only true because we have a consistent God. If God hadn't made the world, I wouldn't have a reason, aside from the fact that I just know that 1 + 1 = 2, or I just know that what we study and learn about in science is true. I couldn't prove any of it. I could only go as far as saying 1 + 1 = 2, and that's where we start. And one of my classmates takes the sort of typical atheistic view: the world is just a random arrangement of particles and energy. How can he prove that 1 + 1 = 2? Well, he can't. He just says that it is. So this is the reason that I enjoy maths and science so much. That God has made some incredible relationships between maths and logic and the real world. I don't understand how Christian scientists, non-Christian scientists even, can be satisfied with their maths when they can't actually prove that 1 + 1 = 2. Or take something more practical. This feels quite sort of philosophical and out there. Let's take something really practical. Newton's second law. I know it's physics, but basically it's a law of physics that describes how forces and motion interact. Now, again, my God is consistent. So I say, God made the world in this very clever way where force is equal to mass times acceleration. Newton's second law applies. And because it applies today, and we've tested it in the past, and it's always been true, and God is consistent, then that must be true forever. Newton's second law is true. But if we start with the fact that the world is just random, if there is no God, then we can theorize that 1 + 1 = 2. We can theorize Newton's second law, and we can say, well, in the past, when we've tested it, force has been equal to mass times acceleration, but we've got no reason to be confident that it will be true tomorrow. Aside from the fact that it's been true in the past, we don't know that it's true, or we can't prove that it's true. We just have to say, yeah, that's a fact. We've decided that it's true. I hope that kind of makes sense. I feel like the maths here can get a bit confusing, but I don't want that to distract from the real point, which is God and the fact that he made this perfect world full of incredible scientific relationships. And I should also explain, like, this idea that God is consistent. Let's just look at that for a minute, because it's quite important in our understanding of the world. I'm pretty confident you guys would say the world is consistent. 1 + 1 does equal 2 every day. Newton's second law applies every day. And so there's plenty of Bible verses that tell us that God is consistent as well. So it makes sense that he would create a consistent world. So here's just 3 that I've picked out. James 1:17 says, "Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow." Or let's go to Hebrews 13:8. I love this verse. "Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever." Now, that's only 3 verses. There's plenty more. And the Bible is so consistent within itself. I find it incredible that people can accept ancient literature about Roman leaders like Caesar and other people. And we've got maybe 5 or 6 original copies from within about 500 years of these people's lives, that books or things that say that they existed and they acted like this, they were a leader, whatever it was they did. We've got maybe 5 copies of the original old texts about these people, and we accept that they existed. We know that Caesar existed, Emperor Nero, people like that. No one denies that they existed. And yet the Bible, of which we've got tens of thousands of manuscripts of, I get quite excited about manuscripts. There's a website where you can go and look at the original New Testament manuscripts. Like, you can see from, I think it's the 3rd century, like 200 years after Jesus' life, which historically is a very short period of time. You can read the texts that these ancient writers wrote about them, these original Bibles. And there's so many more of these, and people say, no, that's all made up. But yeah, Caesar existed, even though there's only 1 or 2 copies of the books that actually talk about him. So anyway, I've digressed again. The Bible and God is completely consistent. And if we understand that God created the world, he created matter and logic and the natural laws, then we can apply that to anything. I've looked at maths here, and I feel like that was a bad choice, just because I get confused by maths quite easily anyway. And it probably wasn't the simplest thing to choose, but we can apply it to anything else as well. It applies to science. Well, I mean, yeah, okay, they're kind of the same thing. It applies to English, say. Like, I can never fully get my head around languages, and like the English language is just sort of cool when I start thinking about it. But God's the only reason that we can have a language that we understand across countries. Like, I'm going to choose a big country here. Russia is massive, and yet people who live thousands of miles away in Russia can still speak to each other and understand each other because they speak the same language, even though they're separated physically by so much distance. Like, that is just kind of cool. That, again, that's not really a helpful point. What was I saying? I've digressed again, thinking about language. Honestly, look at me. Consistency. That's what we were on. So I'm trying to think of an example outside of like science and maths, but I study maths. Like, that's what I know about. Here's a good one. Cooking. I don't know if any of you take it or did food tech or anything. I mean, you all did food tech in like secondary school. You follow a recipe, you put in, let's say you're making a cake, you take flour, you take eggs, you take everything to make a cake, and you mix it up, you follow the instructions on this recipe. Say you're in a classroom with 10 people, you're all following the same recipe, and you all bake your cakes, you put it in the oven. We know that because we've all followed the same recipe, I'm sure some people will have made mistakes, but generally, when you take your cakes out of the oven, they will be a cake. It will have risen a bit, it will be sweet, you'll be able to eat it, and it won't kill you. Like, you're making a cake. So we know that all the science behind baking, which is quite cool, like all of these chemical reactions that make a cake into a cake, we know that they're consistent every day, and they've been consistent throughout history. But again, no one can prove that if we don't start with God. We just say, yeah, I know that if I mix up some flour and some eggs and bake it, I get a cake, and all these chemical reactions happen, and they just happen every time we do it. So, that's how the world works. But there's no proof behind that. Yeah, I hope you're sort of understanding it. I feel like I've gone on really long about this, and it's not making a huge amount of sense. The proof I'm trying to find is we only go so far without God. We can say 1 + 1 is 2, and we define that as a fact. Or Newton's second law, that is a fact. We can't prove it. It just works every time. Yeah, we know it's true. We just know. But I want to go a step further. As soon as we add God, we've got that extra step. We know that he, that one thing, just by starting with God, no other axioms, no other facts, just God, we can define everything else because he's made a consistent world. So if something works once, if 1 + 1 is 2, just once, in God's consistent world, it will always be true. But what does this actually mean? This is the most important point. I've waffled on about maths and creation. Let's go back to Genesis 1 and just the fact that God created the world, which is pretty mental, if you ask me. Like, first of all, this just reminds us that God is at the center of everything. We don't need to look in the Bible to learn about God. Of course, we should read the Bible. It's a brilliant source of knowledge and wisdom, and it's just awesome once you start reading it and really understand it. But we can see in the world that 1 + 1 is 2, and that nature is just consistent and beautiful. And you can see God in that. You know, he created it. If you look at a Picasso painting, you get an idea of what Picasso was like as an artist. And it's the same looking at creation. And yes, I just find it quite incredible and quite mind-blowing that you can understand everything and explain everything, and everything is consistent when we start with God. There's a good analogy, actually, about priorities that I think some of you might have heard before. The speaker or preacher or whoever it is, they get a jar and they fill it with water and then sand and then small rocks, and each of these represents a priority or something we have to do. And there'll be sort of schoolwork, and you've got jobs and shopping. I don't know, shopping, yeah, that's a priority, that counts. And eventually you fill up this jar and there's no more room for the rocks or ping pong balls or whatever it is, and you haven't got room for God, and he's this rock left over and he doesn't fit in your jar. And then they pour it all out again, and they start with the biggest rock. They start with God, and then they fit in smaller rocks, and they pour in sand and water, and wow, it all fits. And they say that if you start with God as this one big thing in your life, everything else fits around him. And I understand that analogy, but I don't think it's perfect. If God made everything in the world, he defines its laws, he is the most important thing, he is at the center of our life, he shouldn't just be the first rock in the jar. Like, he's not just this spiritual thing and we add him in our life and then everything else just fits around him. God is the jar. Like, without God, we're just throwing rocks, sand and water everywhere, but with no purpose. God isn't priority 1, he's priority 0. Like, without him, not only are we useless and pointless, it sounds dark, but without him, that's true, but we would have no basis for science or logic. Like, the oldest original scientists, people like Newton, we're all Christians looking to prove that God existed and demonstrate how amazing his creation was. They knew there was order in his creation. And I do find it quite incredible that so many scientists can just accept what they study and then claim that the world is completely random and everything happens by chance. I was going to include a really long and very mathematical explanation of probability and things like the Big Bang. I might show you some numbers in a bit about it, just the numbers, not the maths, because it is quite interesting. But the point here, the important part, getting back to the point, is when we say put God first or God at the center, we're not talking about a spiritual part of our lives. This is everything. And it's an excellent reason to keep reading the Bible and praying, because the more we understand of God's nature and his personality, the more we can understand creation and our nature as humans made in his image. You can just sort of appreciate everything more, and the more proof we have then for everything that we do. Not to mention the fact that having a personal relationship with the guy who made the universe, like, that's pretty cool. It sounds mind-blowing. I mean, it is mind-blowing. And it's a very difficult thing to properly understand. Like, a lot of Christians, I think, would say, yeah, I've got a personal relationship with the guy who made the universe. But then when you start thinking about how big the universe is, like, this God created everything, the amount of power that he's got, it is just mind-blowing. That's the only way to describe it. And for me, understanding how God defines the rules of nature, it makes me amazed at everything that I learn now. I keep accidentally missing bits of lectures because I start thinking about how amazing it is that we can quantify and understand these very complicated scientific truths because of God's laws of the world. Like, these aren't chance relationships. You never in science find a relationship that just uses horrible numbers. Like, everything adds up. The area of a circle, there's an amazing equation that I would show you, but it uses some letters that are a bit confusing. It would take too long to explain, but there's some amazing equations. I know it sounds totally nerdy, but some of the equations are just cool. And not from like a maths and people are clever kind of point of view. The fact that God programmed these into creation, that's what makes them cool. Like, they just exist. And that's the kind of sort of perspective I wanted to share with you guys tonight. I hope it hasn't been completely confusing, but the point I want to make is God created the world. Like, it's in the first verse of the Bible. I probably could have spent a lot less time talking about it and just given you Genesis 1:1 and said, yeah, there you are, God created the world. But like, the fact that he created the world, when you really think about it, it doesn't influence just our lives. I feel like, yeah, it's quite easy, like that sort of the rocks in a jar analogy. It's quite easy to divide our life up into these different things, these rocks. We've got our spiritual life where we read the Bible and we go to church and we go to CU, and then we've got everything else. We're learning about stuff in college or at university, and maybe we've got jobs, maybe you're learning to drive and you've got your driving sort of life. But we never sort of properly think that actually, if God made the world, he's not just there in spiritual life, he needs to be in everything. Like, he's the reason we can have cars. He's the reason that fuel will combust and it will make energy that will then go into a piston that will make a car move. And that's the reason we can drive around. And he's the reason we've got all of these subjects that you can study, like English and engineering, film studies, catering, everything, hairdressing, only exists because God made the world in the way that he made it. So like, just the amount of things in the world are mind-blowing. I can never comprehend just how big and amazing creation is. Like, take music, just music made by people. Good music is mind-blowing. I was listening to some Hans Zimmer stuff this week. He's a film composer. He did like Pirates of the Caribbean, and it sounds strange for me to say that I was just listening to his stuff, but like, how someone can make a song that fits so well with a film, with something like Interstellar that he composed. Those songs, all they are is basically a piano and a couple of other instruments, but they're incredible. And I can't understand how anyone can design or write a song that is just so good. If I tried to write a song, it would be terrible. But I do understand that God is the reason that music like that exists. And this is possibly the most important part. This is about, like, how do we actually apply it? How we understand that God made the world, and that's a big deal. But what does that mean? We go around everyday life. I think, but I mean, this is just a small application of it, but it's one of my favorite questions is when people ask, how can you study science if you're religious? It always makes me laugh just a little bit, not like in any sort of creepy way, just chuckle. But the only reason I can trust science is because I'm religious. There's a great quote from some monk who said, it's in Latin, I won't read you the Latin. He said, "I believe so that I may understand." It's not the other way around. We don't try to use knowledge to, well, we do use knowledge to prove our faith. I shouldn't say that it's not based off of knowledge. Like, everything that we believe is consistent with the natural world and with science. That's the reason I believe. But it's only because I believe that I can actually then understand just how incredible the natural world is. And it's only because I believe that I can say that 1 + 1 is 2. And I can prove things just by starting with God, rather than trying to come up with an infinite list of facts that define the world, because we don't need that when we start with God. And yeah, I'm hoping, dare I say it, to get you guys thinking about God's creation and to distract you from your lectures and your lessons, just because we've got into this idea that education is where we learn stuff to get a job. And what you're like, is just, I get a job, go to work, earn some money, that's life. But what you're learning about, everything that you guys are learning about, exists because of God. God created it, God understands it. And I just think that's really cool. And I can say from experience that learning is so much more fun when you realize that you're learning about God's creation. And you're like, you look at an equation and you say, yeah, God did that. So yeah, I hope that hasn't been completely confusing. That was not as long as I was expecting to talk for at all. But if you've got any questions, and I'm sure you do, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them if you want to. But yeah, sorry for going on for so long. That really overran. I got very engrossed.
You've gotten me really excited about philosophy. I apologize in advance. But basically, epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? And the whole thing of like, you define knowledge as justified true belief. So for something to be knowledge, it has to be justified. So that's like the actual proof behind it mathematically. You have to believe it's true. But then there's the truth part. And the original guy didn't think about the truth part, but essentially, how do you know something's true? Well, you use the justification, but you also use the justification in the knowledge, if that makes sense. So it's quite hard to define. But basically, a bunch of people go into it like, because you can't actually necessarily say something is true as a statement, because you never know fully that it's true. So a lot of people have like a really kind of almost nihilistic view, that there is no such thing as truth and knowledge. We can't be 100% certain on anything. And I quite like your explanation behind it. It's not my personal explanation as the resident atheist, but I find it quite interesting.
I'm glad to hear that. That's
yeah,
that's very good to hear.
it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very confusing when you start thinking about like how do you prove something.
I guess my next question would be is like, if God was the one who like created all this truth, like how did he have the knowledge to create it? How did he almost have like the framework in his mind to do that? Because that's sort of like almost looking like the next level is like looking at God and the fact he created Earth, but then I start to like think of the higher thing, like after that, what created the way that like he was able to do that almost. So that's why I'm always very, I don't want to say skeptical, but skeptical about.
No, I understand that. It's a very sort of deep question. It's an important one to ask as well, like understanding sort of why God exists and why he is the way we say he is. Like we say in the Bible, it tells us, and we know that he is consistent and he's got all of these great characteristics. He's loving, he's gracious, but yeah, the question of why is quite a good one. And my sort of explanation of it, I haven't had a chance to look into like the big sort of deep theology stuff and the proper theological proofs, but I always sort of go back to the idea of how do we define truth without God? And what probably my favorite explanation actually, because otherwise things get a bit confusing, is what's called the presuppositional approach. So if we start with an atheistic worldview, if we say that there is no God, we can get so far with science and we can say certain things are true and we sort of just have to define truth based on what we see. But if you assume that God exists, everything just makes a lot more sense. Everything is still perfectly consistent. Assuming God exists doesn't mean you have to make any assumptions or change anything, but things just make a bit more sense. And the ultimate answer is I can't prove, just like I can't prove anything, as you said, that truth is a very strange thing to sort of start talking about. I can't factually 100% convince anyone that God exists, but I'm way more convinced, beyond reasonable doubt, totally convinced that he exists compared to any other explanation for the world existing. I'll show you some numbers actually, because this, I'll get my slides back up. This shouldn't be too confusing, but it's something I discovered recently that I find really striking. And it's literally just two different numbers. If I share my screen again, oh, stupid Zoom, come on, there we are. Okay, the number at the top, that is the probability calculated using thermodynamics, the probability that all of the atoms of air in a room randomly, by random motion, gather in one corner. Like, we know that doesn't happen. Rooms don't just turn into vacuums with all of their particles over there in a corner. But that's the probability that it would happen using all the models that we trust for thermodynamics. Like, these are the same models we use for pretty much anything concerning air, gas, solids, materials, anything involving heat will be based on these calculations. So that's the probability of what we would say is impossible. Our thermodynamics professor said, this is so unlikely, we call it zero. And then another scientist called Roger Penrose, he calculated the probability by random chance of a Big Bang-like event occurring. He isn't a Christian. He's I don't know if he's an atheist or an agnostic or whatever he calls himself, but he's not religious, and he's backed up by a lot of scientists in the fact that the probability of a Big Bang event or the world or the universe just being created by random chance has that bottom number many zeros in it. It is so small. A computer can't actually write it because it's such a small number. So on the next slide, hang on, I'm pressing the wrong button. This slide, which will appear in a second, as if by magic, in theory. Will it appear? There's a big delay here. It's appeared on my little screen. Okay, a number will appear. There we are. That is a number with 10,000 zeros for comparison. So it goes 0, 10,000 zeros and a 1. And that is a much more likely probability than the probability that a Big Bang or the universe was created by random chance, which I would argue is zero, basically. Now, of course, like, people do sort of try and explain this. I'm not saying that everyone who's claimed the Big Bang happens is just wrong and it's so obvious, because that would just be a silly claim. People try to come up with explanations for it. There's something called the whale hypothesis, and there's various other reasons. But I don't see why we try to sort of explain our way around these things when, if we start with God, the answer's already in the Bible. We've had it for thousands of years. To me, it seems much more likely than a number with so many zeros. It's 10 to the power of 123 zeros. Like, it's tiny. But as I said, yeah, people do have explanations for this. I just don't think they're very good compared to the idea that God exists. Mm-hmm. Just a fun little side note. I've started going on about stuff again.
No, I find it super interesting. Don't mind me. You've gotten me very excited about philosophy. I'm going to be reading philosophy books the next few days.
I would very much recommend this book. It takes a Christian point, but it just looks at truth and sort of science in quite an interesting way. And it discusses all the different views as well. It's not that biased, so recommend it.
That sounds good. Thank you very much.